Welcome to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Neta Kligler-Vilenchik of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. Neta is a leading scholar of communication with expertise on political expression in the current changing media environment. She was selected as a fellow of the prestigious Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, Caspis, and she's published influential research in top journals and book presses in the field. Neta's talk today will focus on her new book, published by Oxford University Press, titled Not Your Parents' Politics: Understanding Young People's Political Expression on Social Media, which is co-authored with Joanna Literat from Teachers College, Columbia University. To make the most of our time, here's how we'll run this webinar. First, Neta will speak for about a half hour. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who've prepared questions in advance based on a careful reading of the book's first chapter. And third, we'll select questions that participants submit to us in the Q&A submission form that I'll copy into the chat. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send your questions through this form for the panelists' review. A final technical note that I'll also drop in the chat: if you'd like to see a written transcript during the webinar, we've enabled this feature, and you can activate it by clicking on your Zoom screen's bottom right option labeled More, and then click on Transcript. Thank you for joining us, and Neta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm so happy to be here virtually with you and to present my new book. I brought my hard copy here to show with me, Not Your Parents' Politics. And it's a great honor to present it to your class. The ERC project is so relevant to this work. So I'm very excited about the conversation we'll have today. So I'll pull up my slides here. Just one moment. Full screen here. Okay, can you see the slides okay now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So thank you. I'm very excited to be here today and to talk about my new book. And I'd first of all like to give a shout out to my wonderful co-author, Joanna Literat from Teachers College, Columbia University, who is my full partner on this journey and is with us in spirit as well for this discussion. So I'll start a little bit with sort of the big picture and the book's main arguments before going in. And I think that pretty quickly the connection to participation and representation will become quite clear. And so we suggest that social media today are a key space where young people engage not only in self-expression in general around their lives, their hobbies, their musical interests, and so on, but also around their politics. And in that sense, social media are also a window into young people as political actors, into understanding some of their political and social concerns, what they care about, how they feel about different issues. However, seeing social media as a place for young people's political representation is not clear-cut, or it's not direct, because it requires listening to the political voices of young people in a way that is contrary to a lot of our expectations. So we have to listen to their voice, not based on our expectations of what political expression maybe should look like or usually does look like, but rather in their own preferred modes of expression. And just to get a little bit of a sense of what that is, I have this image here from one video, an example from Musical.ly, and we're all, I think by now quite familiar with how political expression on social media looks and feels quite different from what we may expect. So we think about these styles of expression on social media as, first of all, speaking to the platform vernacular. So they're often adapted to the sort of language and expression styles of the different platforms that we look at. And soon I'll talk about what the platforms are that we look at. And the kind of expression that then happens is quite different from maybe our sort of like idealized expectations of, oh, this is what political expression should be. So we often think political expression is something that should be, serious or somber. We're dealing with important issues here. And instead, we see on social media an expression that's humoristic and colorful and infused with pop culture. We sometimes think that political expression is something that should be rational, it should be fact-based, and instead we see on social media youth political expression that's very emotional. It shows emotions ranging from fear and anger to happiness and joy. And in contrast, maybe to our expectations that political expression is something that should be detached and objective, we see on social media a form of political expression that comes very much from the personal vantage point. So how does this affect my life? What implications will it have on me, on my friends, on my community? How do I see this from my point of view? And before I go into thinking about how we should take into account or take seriously this kind of political expression, I'll just also invite us all to somewhat question our expectations, right? Because we may expect political expression to be serious and rational and objective, but really we can ask ourselves, is it that way? Even when we're talking about older generations, even in fact when we talk about many politicians today. But with that in mind, we go to the political expression of young people. And this idea of disentangling maybe what's out there for what we think should be there is the basis for three main aims that lead us in the book. And the first aim is a descriptive aim. And here we're trying to basically showcase this is the kind of youth political expression that is taking place today on the social media platforms that are most popular with young people, that maybe some adults or some journalists or politicians or stakeholders are not on, are not familiar with. They're not familiar with their forms of expression or their norms of expression. So first of all, we're trying to show it as it is, to give a window into it. Our second aim is a theoretical aim. This is one that may speak maybe specifically to students of communication, although I think other scholars may find interest in it as well. And here we ask, how do different platforms shape political expression in different ways? So why is it, for example, that political expression looks and feels quite different, let's say on TikTok versus on YouTube, even though both may use videos? And the third aim is a normative aim. So building on the descriptive and the theoretical, we then are ready or are equipped to ask, does the kind of political expression that we analyze throughout our book promote democratic goals, and of what kinds? And I think that this normative question is a very central one for thinking about participation and representation. And so in today's talk, I'll sort of run with you through these three aims. But maybe first of all, I'll introduce the key term or concept that we're working with, political expression. And you may be familiar with the idea or sort of sense that it is a relatively new concept. So versus, forms, concepts like participation and representation, which are very established concepts and terms. Political expression is a relatively new idea and concept, and it sort of came to age together with the rise of social media. So we can look at a few recent definitions of it. So Velasquez and Rojas talk about political expression as communications that express a specific opinion on current events or political processes, or that disseminate information that's relevant to the interpretation of these events or processes. And this is sort of a definition that we started off in some of our early work. There's also a recent definition by Lane et al. That also talks about political expression as having a lot to do also with identity and identity formation. And why should we care about political expression? These are things that we also know from the world of political conversation and political dialogue. When we express our politics, when we have to put them out there for others to examine, it helps to clarify our own views. It helps to understand the connection between politics and everyday life. And this is, of course, especially important when we're talking about young people who are still in the process of political socialization. Political expression also matters because it is related to other participatory or political acts, including traditional political acts such as voting, including, of course, mobilization and action. And we'll talk about that as well when we talk later about the relation between expression and participation. So we talk here about youth, but youth is a broad category, and I want to explain a little bit what we mean by youth. So within sort of the broad category, we have three subcategories. So we look both at kids aged 13 and under. They shouldn't be on social media because it is against the terms of service, but they are. And we see them including in terms of political participation. We look at teens age 13 and 18 who are sort of in the process of coming to terms with their political voice, with their political views, and also young adults who are also already of voting age in many countries, most countries in the world, from age 18 to age 29. But still, we know when we think about representation that almost universally they are a group that is underrepresented in terms of their political voice and voting. And so all these groups are ones that are of interest to us. And we focus on youth because of the long-lasting role of experience with politics in the formative years. So really the kind of political socialization that will happen in these ages will shape the political citizen that they will become in the future. But it's important to say that we're not necessarily coming from the vantage point that young people don't care about politics, and that's why we should look at their political expression. These are maybe have been voices or discourses that were more dominant maybe 15, 20 years ago, and they're giving way somewhat to different concerns that think about young people as very much engaged in political issues, but maybe disenchanted with politics as usual, often cynical. And here we must admit, these are problems that plague not only young people, but broader publics as well. And it's important to also remember that a lot of the discussion around youth and social media is characterized by what we as media scholars call moral panics. So we'll often be concerned about things like screen time or addiction or the role of social media in political polarization. And we try to not, of course, ignore these dangers and concerns while also taking a vantage point that tries to look and understand and respect the lived experience of young people and their voices. So a little bit about how the book is structured. So the students read the introduction chapter that sort of sets the case for the whole book. And of course, in a 30-minute talk, I can't talk about all the book, although I would love to. But I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So after the introduction chapter and the theory chapter that I'll soon talk a little bit about how platforms shape expression, the book is built around three platforms and three case studies. The platforms we look at are Musical.ly, which is the precursor to TikTok. We look around the 2016 US election, and there we sort of focus on the more institutional politics, electoral politics. We have a chapter devoted to YouTube where we focus on climate anxiety. So the sense or the discourse around climate anxiety, where some young people feel anxious and depressed and concerned around climate change. And a chapter devoted to Instagram, where we look at racial justice, specifically hashtag Justice for Bree around the shooting of Breonna Taylor. Throughout the book, our method is a qualitative content analysis of content shared by youth on social media. And of course, this raises interesting methodological questions. How do we know that they're youth? Why did we choose these platforms and not others? How do we know if they even see what they are doing as political, and so on? And so I invite you to maybe ask me about those things in the Q&A. I'll also give a little shout out to our methodological appendix of the book, that tries to really give the behind the scenes of how we did this research in practice, and also gives us a little bit of a how-to guide for maybe students or more novice scholars who are interested in doing qualitative content analysis of social media content. So I mentioned that the second aim that we had our first aim was the descriptive aim, where we sort of showcase the different case studies of political expression. And I'll say a little bit also about the cases that we chose. You may notice that there's a bit of a move here, going from sort of strictly institutional politics, focusing on voting and election, to racial justice, which is a topic around identity politics and around broader conversations, and climate anxiety is a topic that's both very much top of mind for young people, and also this is our most international chapter in terms of our focus, whereas the two first ones, the Instagram and the Musical.ly TikTok ones, are a little bit more US focused. Okay. So a little bit about our norms, affordances, contents framework. So these are a lot of sort of maybe buzzwords that may be a little bit intimidating for those outside of communication discipline. But basically what we try to do with this model or this framework is to help understand how it is that the different platforms that we're studying shape the kind of expression that we end up seeing, both what people post and also what the algorithm shows us. And so chapter 2 of the book is devoted to this framework. I'll just give a brief overview of what it looks at or what it contains. So under norms, we look at expression norms, and we ask, what do people perceive as appropriate on a certain platform in terms of political expression? What kinds of political expression are seen as appropriate or even desirable for that kind of platform? Norms then work together or interact with the affordances. Affordances are what a certain platform enables us to do, but also what it constrains. And in our framework, we speak about two broad affordances that are relevant to many different social media platforms, which are expressivity, the ability to express yourself through rich multimodality, and connectivity, the ability to connect to other actors in terms of visibility. Norms and affordances together then shape contents, both the kind of contents that people choose to post, but also the contents that the platform then makes salient to us and shows us by the platform design and by the algorithms. The contents we see then also cyclically change back or shape back the norms that we perceive, our sense of what is appropriate and desirable on that platform. And that arrow is then what also accounts for the ability for change over time. So for example, we can think about how Instagram maybe used to be seen as a more apolitical, non-political platform, more devoted to like lifestyle and sunsets and drinks. But over time, around 2020, has become increasingly politicized. So that arrow from contents to norms is where we take into account these kind of changes. So this is for our theoretical aim. And now I want to devote the last 10 minutes or so of my talk today to the normative aim, because I think that in many ways it is the one that's most pertinent to our conversation here, to this conversation series on participation and representation. And here the question that guides us is, what kind of citizenship does this kind of expression represent? And after we've understood and identified it, in what ways does it promote democratic goals? So I want to briefly present the idea of citizenship models before talking about a kind of citizenship model that we identified, expressive citizenship. This is all from chapter 6 of the book. So citizenship models are basically expectations of who is a good citizen, how is a good citizen supposed to behave. And I think the most dominant citizenship model that many of us will be familiar with is the idea of informed citizen, which is the idea that to be a good citizen, you have to know what's going on in politics, you have to be up to date on current events. And this is often sort of described as what we would want, what we want to achieve, or maybe as also the good citizenship of the past. But again, we somewhat need to temper our expectations or to be realistic. And realistically, we know that informed citizenship is more of an aspiration than a description of reality, right? Not just for young people, for all citizens. Deli Carpini and Keeter already showed in '96 that most people are not necessarily informed citizens. In contrast to those sort of aspirative or normative citizenship models, we can also think about citizenship models that are descriptive or emergent. And these derive from describing behavior that we see now, that we observe now, and expectations that we see around us. And the kind of citizenship model that I'll talk about soon of expressive citizenship needs to be understood as a descriptive or emergent citizenship model. So it describes more of what we see rather than necessarily what we think should be. And we'll soon grapple a little bit with those questions. And so with that, a little bit of background in mind, we can now talk about the model of citizenship we identify in the book, which we call expressive citizenship. So this is based on our analysis throughout the book, looking at how young people engage with these different political issues, both institutional politics, identity politics, and climate change. We identify that the kind of political expression we observe reflects an emergent citizenship model, so one that sort of comes from describing and seeing, according to which, first of all, publicly expressing your views around current events, including on social media, is seen as a form of political participation in and of itself. Okay, so we know that in the past, sometimes we looked at political expression or political conversation, but these were often seen as predictors for other real political participation factors or variables like voting or like donating money or political knowledge. But within expressive citizenship, the very act of expressing yourself, that is a political act. And not only is it a political act, it is a political act that is seen as important and at times necessary and even expected of good citizen. So especially at times of turmoil, the idea of expressive citizenship sets an expectations that good citizens will take to social media and will express their views around an important public event. And we can think about several recent examples of this. The Black Lives Matter movement is a central idea or central example of expressive citizenship, where we can think about times when everyone felt like they were expected to post about Black Lives Matter. We saw organizations do it, we saw everyday people do it, we saw celebrities do it, we saw even local barbershops feeling that they have to post a Black Lives Matter post at that time. The Ukraine war is also a recent example of expressive citizenship expectations of a time when people felt that this was what was expected of good citizens. And another example that is an interesting one for us as Israelis to grapple with is pro-Palestinian movements and the idea of the war in Gaza, which also presented a form of expressive citizenship, or sort of set this expectation that everyone felt that they had to voice an opinion around it on social media. And so thinking about this as sort of a descriptive model, one that comes from what we see, what we observe, in contrast to an aspirational model, which is what we think we should have, leads us to ask the question, does expressive citizenship promote democratic goals? And to answer that question, we build on Diana Mutz by distinguishing between two kinds of democratic goals and then evaluating each one of them. So a first democratic goal is a mobilizational goal. This centers on connection to like-minded others. So we talk mostly to people who have similar views, similar political views to ours. And really the idea is to get people to know that something is happening, to be engaged, to be active, to participate, right? So maybe we want them to post about it, we want them to come to a protest, we want them to write to a political representative and so on. And for mobilizational goals, we can see in general, so both empirical research that examines social media expression and participation in the past decades shows that in contrast maybe to early concerns about slacktivism or about replacement hypotheses and so on, political expression on social media is quite conducive to mobilizational goals. It's quite good in actually getting people to connect to like-minded others and to also go and do something about it. One of the reasons it's good for it, by the way, is because the bars for participation can be quite low and can be sort of easy to do threshold acts that can then be translated into something that you do that's increasingly more demanding. However, democracy also needs an additional goal, and that's what Mutz calls the discursive goal. And this is where we have communication that's across political lines. We talk to people that we disagree with. We have conversations that sometimes can be uncomfortable. And research shows that having these heterogeneous conversations, communicating across political lines, is something that helps to achieve tolerance. It helps to achieve the understanding of others' viewpoints. It is, however, not conducive to mobilization because sometimes when we talk to others who think differently from us, it has a dampening effect. But when we think about social media and about expressive citizenship, and we think about whether it is conducive towards discursive goal, generally, our answer will be no, because both of platform affordances, because of norms of expression, because of the kinds of expression that social media logic affords us and encourages us to engage in, of course, within also social and political realities that are happening, social media or expression on social media today generally is not very conducive to having a meaningful dialogue with the other side and having conversations. And so these are questions that we need to hold together.
Neta,
Even
about
for
3 more minutes.
Yes, got it. Even for the mobilizational goal, it's important to understand expressive citizenship still has upsides and downsides. Because on the one hand, it entails a commitment to be involved and vocal because of the way that it also combines emotional and identity-related aspects. However, this expectation for everyone to opine, this expectation for expression, may also lead for expression that can be uninformed or misinformed and can lead to shallow expression of views or to expression that is performative. So even for the mobilizational goal, we still see that it's complex. And so if we have this sense, right, it's somewhat good for a mobilizational goal. It's definitely not very conducive for a discursive goal. We can also ask which goal is more important and in what times. So Matt's writing in 2006 says that if she had to choose, she would have to prefer the discursive goal. She thinks that dialogue is very important. But we are at times of turmoil, maybe more so than in 2006. And these are times that sometimes may require more mobilization for protecting democracy, for protecting the rights of disenfranchised communities. And so we leave this as an open question, maybe also for the audience here interested in participation and representation to think about which goals are more important at different times. And importantly, how do we maintain this balance between expressive citizenship and also the stability that is required for democracy over time? And so my final point would be that it's not enough to just be pushing for more participation, more expression, more social media platforms, but rather the questions that should be leading us are what kinds of political expression and participation will be beneficial for the health of democracy? How may these be achieved? And how do we then bridge between the normative goals and what we aspire for in our democracies and the kind of expression and participation that's taking place today? And with that, I'll thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Neta, for that very interesting overview. And I'll now kick off our first round of Q&A. Our students in the course who are panelists in the webinar read this first chapter carefully and have a first set of questions. They'll ask the questions one at a time, and then we'll open it up for questions from the participants. So the first question is from Noah Nadel, who also studies communications. Noah.
Hi. So first of all, I really liked the talk you just gave. It was really interesting. And I wanted to ask if your research showed differences between social media platform and matter for how much they support young people's political expressions. Like, for example, my personal impression is that TikTok has powerful influence on young people idea, but Instagram lets people use their the power of their keyboards.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So you all read the first chapter sort of in depth, and in the talk I gave a bit of the overview also of the other chapters. So now, Noah, right, I'll encourage you to check out chapter 2, which is sort of devoted to this very idea, right? How do different platforms shape the expression? And yes, I very much agree with you. One of the arguments we make in that chapter especially is that we can't really be talking about social media as an umbrella term when we try to understand its political effects, because really these vary by platform. And to try to explain how that varies, we introduce our norms, affordances, contents model that we think helps to think through this. So if, for example, we take your platforms that you asked about, Instagram and TikTok, we can think about how the norms of expression vary somewhat on these two platforms. So, for example, the platform vernacular of Instagram goes a little bit more for a polished, idealized, visual, very aesthetic visual representation, whereas TikTok goes for something that's more maybe authentic, more playful, and that also shapes the political expression there. In terms of affordances, TikTok is very rich in terms of affording expressivity. So it really affords a multimodal expression by using things like hashtags, audio choice, duets, green screens, and so on. And young people really make very rich use of these for their expression. In terms of connectivity, it's interesting that on TikTok, you mostly see content based on what the For You algorithm shows you more than the people that you're connected with. And that, of course, also shapes its sort of role in politics. And so, yes, we're very much interested in how different platforms shape the political content that people post and also what's shown to them. The last part of your question has to do a little bit with the effects of that content, which is something that we cannot examine because we do a content analysis, but it's definitely a very interesting and important follow-up question. So thank you, Noah.
Excellent. Our next question is from Yakov Kalminsky, who finished his BA at the Open University and is an auditor in our course. Yakov.
Hello, Noah. Hello, hello, Neta. Hello, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. And I'm actually building up on Noah's question because my question is about the social media's algorithmic influence. As I wonder if your research gives insight into how citizens and political leaders have responded to the private companies that might abuse the political sphere of social media, because such of the example of Cambridge Analytica, and whether responses from political leaders has changed over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Yaakov. That's a great question. So the algorithm definitely, I think, gives methodological challenges for researchers of social media, and really for all of us when we're trying to understand social media, right? So because the algorithm means that each person is exposed to their own version of the platform, it also makes it very hard to study. So in our book, because we do a qualitative content analysis, we usually use hashtags as our entry point into the data. That means that we don't really see the algorithmic influence, because instead we go and look for things based on the hashtag. That also means that our perspective is a little bit different than the ones users will get, because usually users will see what the algorithm shows them rather than peruse the whole hashtag. And that is a methodological constraint that we have to work with. But thinking about sort of the second question of your question, the abuse question, it raises a really important point, that we try to make the argument that social media can be a space for political socialization for young people. It is a space where political socialization of young people happens today. That's a fact. But the fact is also that it happens in a space that is governed by for-profit companies whose main interest is making money for their shareholders. So that's definitely not an ideal public space for political socialization. So yes, examples like Cambridge Analytica show this. I just saw very recently data that shows that 10% of ads on, I believe it was Facebook and Instagram, are for scams that Facebook and Instagram know are scams and still leave them on because of profit considerations. And of course, when we get into political abuse, it's all the more concerning with the entry of bots, of rogue actors, and so on. And so we see here political socialization that's happening in a space that's very much it's almost a Wild West, right? And unfortunately, in my view, I think many governments, especially the US, is going away from tendencies of trying to somewhat regulate it or trying to govern that, and instead is going more for a sort of free speech environment, where really free speech means we're not trying to make sure that that there's no misinformation, there's no hate speech, there's no abuse, and so on. So yes, really important questions, and I think increasingly more and more important. Thank you, Yaakov.
Excellent. Thanks for that. As we transition to this next question from still in the first round from student panelists, I'm putting in again the chat to the Q&A. We already received a number of questions for the second round, so a reminder, if you want to ask a question in the second round, go ahead and submit there. And also thanks and a shout out. I just want to note here, we have some world-class researchers here from all over the world. Dr. Arndt Landinger from Berlin, who's here, who's just launching his own ERC project. We have Professor Lilach Nir from the Hebrew University, Dr. Liran Harzgor from Haifa, Dr. Yael Kaplan from the Open University, just to mention a few. So I welcome also our world-class researchers to join in the second round if you'd like. Returning to our first round of questions, our next one, I believe, comes from Alon Resnick, who also studies conflict management and Jewish philosophy.
First of all, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And after reading chapter 1 and hearing the talk, it gives a much more understanding of the topic. So my question is, your book suggested that the political expression of on social media is one of the most important ways that most young people participate in politics. But I wonder if your research indicates that more traditional forms of participation are also still relevant for young people.
Yes, thank you, Elon, for that question. Yes, of course. I think ours, again, we have our, part of this is a methodological question, right? So because our methodology is content analysis, qualitative content analysis of social media content, we haven't spoken to the participants themselves, so we don't know exactly what other things they do. We see some indications within our materials also of other forms of participation. So, for example, in the Black Lives Matter chapter, looking at hashtag for Breonna Taylor, people share about how, for example, they called political representatives to demand justice for Breonna. Or we see in the Musically chapter, we see people posting from protests that they went to and sort of posting it with, my first protest. So we see some indications for that. But really, where we talk more about the connections to traditional forms of participation is in the discussion chapter. And as I said there, we talk about how also building, of course, on other empirical quantitative also research that helps us make the basis for these claims, we can say that political expression, again, counter to maybe slacktivism concerns and so on, and social media panics, actually goes hand in hand with other forms of participation. So it's not necessarily that everyone who will express themselves on social media will also attend protests and go vote and, donate money and learn about, the political leanings of all candidates and so on. But it does go together. There is a correlation there. And there is also a sense that through perceiving yourself as someone who's politically engaged, through your expression, that is also something that then spurs behavior. And our colleague Dan Lane at University of Santa Barbara has also shown some of that in his work. And so yes, we definitely see still the connection to the traditional forms of participation, and we see the expression as going hand in hand with them. Thank you.
I'll add into that question. In our class, I asked a follow-up of how would you define that traditional participation? And the answer was in-person protest, right? And usually when we study political behavior, that's considered non-traditional, right? But in the current era, the students are on target that the question of what's traditional has shifted.
Yeah, the boundaries have shifted for what's traditional and what's the new forms of participation.
Yeah, excellent. Great. Next question is from Dvir Golan, who also studies Jewish history.
Hey, first of all, thank you for the great article. I think the subject is very important, especially for youth population. My question is, your book makes a convincing argument that social media is good for youth political expression, but also it made me wonder, how do you think of the increasing disadvantages of social media, including its populistic character? And can you suggest how can we consider the pros and the cons of contemporary social media for political expressions?
Thank you, Dvir. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think, chapter 1 really sort of sets the stage for saying social media is a space we should be looking at. And really, chapter 6 is where, as I presented briefly today, we really go into our more elaborate discussion of, is this good for democracy or not? And I think you really touch on that in your question, because we too, in that chapter, go into some of these pros and cons. So in terms of when we're thinking about it from the perspective of the young people themselves, a big pro, let's call it that, of social media is that it opens young people to even think about their connection to politics. And this is for me sort of the through line in all of my research interests, is I'm always interested in how regular people, everyday people, especially young people, but not only, how do we find our connection to this big thing that's called politics that sometimes feels very distant. And social media is definitely a way for young people to feel more connected to it, because on social media they engage with it with their peers in their preferred platforms where they feel comfortable, in their preferred modes of expression. So that is a pro for young people's political socialization. The con, however, is that, as we mentioned before, this political socialization happens in a space that is not, it's not a safe space, right? It's not a clean or pure space. And we have different kind of interests that intermingle there. We have the economic interests of the platforms themselves. We have political interests of different actors. And we also have, as we also talked to Yaakov's question, we also have rogue actors, or actors who are really trying to manipulate those spaces and sort of sway the conversation, even with content that can be inauthentic. And of course, the rise of AI gives us an increasing concern in that sense, because it's easier than ever to create content that is completely fabricated, and including video content, and upload it. And so it's not necessarily that we say that social media are a good space for young people's political socialization. What we are saying is they are a space where it happens. And so that means that we have to understand it. And asking how we can make it better is a big question that I think all of us should be asking together. So both academics, educators, governments, social media platforms, journalists, nonprofit organizations, and so on. This should be a shared project of all of us to try and think about how we can make it better. Thank you, Tvil.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Our next question is from Yotam Omer, who also studies communication.
Hi, Neta. First of all, let me say this article has been very interesting, and throughout reading it, a big question that came to me is that if you found any interesting outliers in your research, such as teens who were anti-political, young people posting against political expression, maybe from desperation or yeah, so anything negative.
Yeah, I love that question. I think as qualitative researchers, we're often very much interested in outliers, right? So in quantitative research, sometimes you just outliers are a problem and you're trying to erase them from your data set. And in qualitative research, often they put a light on something that's very interesting. Because of our methodology, we aren't quite able to capture people who just don't post about politics, because we're using as our entry point hashtags that are political, and that is also a methodological choice that we make knowingly, because we say that is one of the things that for us justifies looking at the content that young people put on social media. Because they're trying to be part of a political conversation, they're using hashtags in order to be part of that conversation. And that's also something we talk about in our 2019 article, where we talk about collective political expression. So we don't really see people who just don't post about politics, but we do see outliers in terms of the kinds of political statements that are made. And sometimes people go to social media to speak against something, or they use a hashtag to speak against it. So for example, in our Musical.ly chapter, it's sort of, we look at hashtag Make America Great Again and hashtag Not My President, but sometimes people will use, let's say, hashtag Make America Great Again to tag their video that goes very much against Trump, because they're actually trying to speak to that audience, sort of, rile them up a little bit, go against it a little bit. So these are some examples that we saw. I'd say that what we saw in terms of being against politics or being negative against politics, we saw a lot of negativity towards politicians and towards politics as usual. So throughout, I'd say the different case studies, there's a lot of cynicism towards traditional politics, in a sense that politicians don't listen to everyday people, especially not to youth. They don't care about what youth care about. We saw a lot of this in the climate change article. Climate change chapter. Young people feel that politicians don't care about climate change because it won't affect older people as much as it will affect younger people. So we definitely saw a lot of cynicism towards politics there. Thank you.
Excellent. And our last question in this first round is from Shira Zahavi, who also studies communication.
Hi, so first of all, thank you very much. The topic is very interesting to me personally. So, I'm really curious, do you think your finding in this book also apply to Israel, or are there some findings that would be meaningfully different in Israel, in Israeli context? For example, the way youth express themselves in the social media.
Yes, thank you for that question, for the opportunity to talk about Israel. So in the book, sometimes Ioana and I joke about it because she was born in Romania and I'm Israeli. So why are a Romanian and an Israeli writing a book that's mostly about young people in the US? And of course, the answer has a little bit to do with the politics of academia. In a sense, it's easier to write about US politics sometimes than to talk about Israeli politics. And then you get questions like, well, but is this representative for other places? places, as if, research about the US necessarily is. So that is, part of that question. I'm very much interested in thinking about these questions in the Israeli context. I do that a lot through my work with graduate students and doctoral students, and I can give a shout out to my doctoral student, Dganit Levy, who has done research in the Israeli context, both with climate change activists, Fridays for Future activists in Israel, looking at their social media participation and expression, and also actually a very interesting third stage of her doctorate that is doing an in-school intervention program that is aimed to talk to young people about thinking about political expression on social media. When is it good? What is it good for? How to do it in a way that's conducive to your goals and so on. So some of the things that I found regarding political expression in Israel is one thing that still surprises me, and I'm not quite sure how to understand it, is that I don't see as much of the kind of youth political expression that I analyze in the book. I don't see as much of that coming from young Israelis. And that surprises me because young Israelis are very much politically engaged, politically knowledgeable, they care about politics, they're quite active in politics, they express themselves. And yet, when you go into TikTok or Instagram and you're sort of looking for, the big topics of the day, you don't see that much content that comes bottom up from everyday young people. And I talk to young people and I try to understand why that is, so a little bit anecdotally, but sometimes also in more organized research contexts. And I think some of it comes with the hesitation of young people in Israel to express themselves politically because the political environment feels very divisive. So a lot of them will sometimes, they'll share things, but they'll share it only to their close friends or only in a close circle. So why then the difference from the US? Why did we see so much more of it in the book? Obviously the US is a much, much larger country, much bigger, larger amounts of young people. And so even if we look at something that only a niche population do, we'll have much more content there. There may also be something that's increasingly happening worldwide, maybe, which is a bit of a trend that goes against expression. I think a lot of everyday users are not expressing themselves as much on social media, not on political topics, but maybe also in general. So social media are slowly becoming more dominated by influencers and by sort of elite actors. And maybe everyday citizens are somewhat more wary about sharing their sort of bottom-up expression on social media. So these are still questions I grapple with. It makes studying these questions in Israel a little bit more tricky. But I'd love to try and understand that more through maybe a research project that not only looks at social media content, but also talks to young people.
We'll be interested to learn more about it. Excellent. So we're now going into the second round of questions that came both from people who submitted questions in advance of the webinar, and then also a number during. We may not get to all of them, but we'll get started with Dr. Omri Cohen, who finished his PhD in our department at Ben-Gurion University and is now early morning at Berkeley during his postdoc with an excellent question. So Omri, please. And also alumni of this course. I had to add that.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Thanks. This was a really fascinating talk, and I have so many questions. I'd love to continue the conversation maybe at a later point. I'll keep it short. To what extent do you think that the platform, the communications technology itself determines politics? I'm asking this beyond like platform affordances, right? So it seems to me that if you go and ask political scientists, some of them will say it has a much greater effect or like more influence because they talk about polarization and extremism and can we survive the internet and so on. And if you go and ask communication scholars, they'll give a different response, which is like there's good and bad. It can organize like pro-democracy people, but also fascists. And where do you stand on this debate?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a fascinating question. So I would say that our norms affordances contents model or framework is part of our theoretical way to engage with that question. And it's important to say that in that question, that very much comes from a calm perspective. It's not necessarily that we present something that's new. So all of these aspects are aspects that others have done work on. But we try to talk a bit about how they interact together. So as you say, it's not just platform affordances. We look at how platform affordances work together with norms of expression, which are both what people see on the platform and what people perceive then is more appropriate there. And then the way that shapes the content is both by what people choose to post, but as we said, also by what the algorithm shows us. And in terms of your question, it's sort of this big question, right, about effects. And I often get the question also about social media and polarization. And I think you're right to point out that I think comm scholars will sometimes look at it differently than political science. And I think that has to do with several things. I think, sometimes there's these attempts to ask these big questions about social media as a whole. So, is social media create more polarization? Does social media create more hate speech? And I think that comm scholars are more sensitive to intra-platform differences. So, for example, our framework talks about how, you really can't say that, let's say, TikTok and YouTube work together in terms of whether they lead or do not lead to more polarization because of these different dynamics that happen there. So this is one place where more nuance is needed. I'll say also methodologically, being a qualitative researcher or sometimes a mixed methods researcher, I think there's also a question of the perspective that we take. So when I look at social media content and I try to understand it from users' perspectives, I think that is a point of view that also ideologically assigns more agency to participants and to their choices. And I think that sometimes sort of macro work that looks from above and aggregates data without talking to participants sometimes can be a little bit quicker in sort of assuming effects and providing less agency to participants. So these are some of the ways that I think about it. I think a lot of nuance is needed. I think a lot of the big claims, social media doesn't do this or that. A lot of it is, context dependent, it's platform dependent, it's case dependent. It has to do with both the micro levels of individuals and the macro levels of things like the political structure of the country, the rates of polarization and so on. All these are things that shape these dynamics. And I think much more nuance is needed in answering these questions. So the answer is it's complicated.
Great. And our last question in from the participants, Liran Harzgor, Dr. Liran Harzgor, isn't able to turn on her video, but has a question to ask out loud. Liran?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Neta, and it's fascinating, really. I'm just curious if you observed or noticed any differences between age groups, so between the younger and the older in your sample.
Yeah, and I'll add in our students had questions also about gender, class, but focus mainly on Liran's question. But if you want to throw other things in, you're welcome to.
Sure, I will. So differences between age groups. So yes, I mentioned in the beginning that, youth is a very big umbrella term. And we look both at kids under 13 and we look at teenagers 13 to 18 and we look at young people 18 to 29. Careful readers will notice that the chapters are also somewhat divided that way. So our Musical.ly chapter has a bit of more of a focus on kids. Our Instagram chapter looks more at teens. Our climate change chapter looks more at teens, and the Instagram Black Lives Matter looks more at young people. So we also chose case studies that somewhat highlight these different modes of participation and expression. I would say that the biggest difference is you can see it when you look at the youngest age group and you look at kids. And really, you know, often I'll present some of this work and I'll show people a video of like a 10-year-old doing a political a TikTok video against Trump in her bedroom, and people will go and say, "Oh, you know, she's just parroting what her parents taught her," and against that, we'll come and say, "Well, you know, she's in the process of coming to terms with her political voice. So this is something that takes practice, and political expression on social media may be one way that that they do that." And then when we look at, you know, sort of the young people, the 18 to 29s, we do that more in the Black Lives Matter chapter. This will look more like the kind of political expression that we might sometimes expect or see from older participants, maybe more textual based, maybe more sort of sometimes aware of itself, whereas there's something about the young people that's very, very raw. Very exposed, somewhat vulnerable, I'd say. I mean, from my perspective, just, you know, being very out there with what you see and how you see it. And I'll also just say that it's an interesting process that we also can see change throughout time. So I won't mention the name, but one of the kids that we looked at on Musical.ly who did huge pro-Trump videos when he was maybe 10 or 11 is now a huge Trump influencer and has 250K followers on Instagram, right? So we can also see that development. We see that the kind of things that young people sort of practice with and do playfully can become something that's quite meaningful, even politically, as they turn older. So I hope that helps to answer the question. So we look at it again qualitatively, so I can speak more to sort of, you know, trends and things that I notice more than specific variables that have an effect.
Well, thanks everyone for such a rich discussion. Thanks to Neta, our course panelists, and all of you who joined us. We look forward to seeing you again in the next 2 webinars of our fall series featured on this slide. Our next webinar is December 10th with James Druckmann, also known as Jamie Druckmann from the University of Rochester, on reducing anti-democratic attitudes. And January 14th, we have Anya Neundorf from the University of Glasgow on promoting democracy through social media. So thanks everyone for joining you, and we'll see you next time.